Okay, so welcome everyone to the afternoon session. Thank you for choosing us. I'm sure you make the right choice. Unlike the wider world, there will be great mobility this afternoon, and you will actually be able to choose at the end of this first part of the afternoon to go to one of the other sessions. So we've got a 5-minute break between each session if you decide you want to move to the other room, or indeed to enable other people to come in here. That does mean I'll be fairly strict about time, so each of the sets of speakers will have 20 minutes, and then we'll have around 10 minutes for questions at the end of all of that. So we've got 3 sessions this afternoon in this room. One is on UK academics and their industry engagements, we'll have a moment. Second is on for-profit HE in the US, and the third is on worldwide reforms to student loans policy. I mean, what you've got here is researchers based in Europe observing the UK, researchers based in the UK observing America, and a researcher based in Australia observing the whole world. So a great example of how global is actually at the heart of everything that the Centre does. So just to kick off, I'm really pleased to welcome Robert Tijssen and Alfredo Yegros. Robert is Professor of Science and Innovation Studies at Leiden, as I'm sure you know, and also a professor at Stellenbosch in South Africa. He works on the intersection between science, innovation, and HE systems, including issues like university research and development performance, knowledge flows, and technical innovation. Alfredo is a researcher at the Centre for Science and Technology Studies at Leiden. Also, he works on quantitative studies of science and technology, public-private research interactions, and knowledge flows, and the study of science and technology linkages. I'm going to hand over to Robert, who will seamlessly take you through the next 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Chairman. Let me start by saying that I'm delighted to be here today with you all, and I will be presenting the first results actually of an ongoing study we're doing here at CG. And we decided actually to do the presentation today, and actually we've already produced a working paper, which most of you already have, because we felt that the results so far are not only very encouraging, but also very interesting and sufficiently interesting to distribute at this point in time, although they are still, in a sense, preliminary. They do give us a very nice impression of the collaborative links, the patterns we see among UK universities and industry. I should perhaps say that originally this study was meant to be a sort of a critique of university world rankings, in which I'm also involved. And I noticed during my work for university world rankings that I was a bit frustrated with the lack of detail, but more so the lack of addressing some key questions that many university executives face nowadays. And it seemed that the kind of work I was doing, the kind of data I was producing, simply didn't make a difference, simply didn't address these questions in sufficient detail and in sufficient level of information. So this was basically my first driver, and in this particular case, in this particular presentation, I will be focusing on the last question we see here on the list. What is the added value of a university, particularly a research-intensive university, to society, but more so towards the local, domestic, or even global economy? So this last question was really my main driver, until, of course, something suddenly happened in the UK, and I had to sort of reorient my question of my study also to deal with this question that has suddenly emerged here in the UK university system: how to deal with Brexit. Unfortunately, the kind of data I was collecting actually allowed us to present some empirical data on the, let's say, the vulnerability of UK universities within this Brexit development. And I will return to the issue of Brexit later in my last part of the presentation. But first, about the local economy. I perhaps should stress here that collecting data, I'm looking at a very exploratory way of collecting data, and it's also very much descriptive, at least in this presentation. So basically you will see numbers and the patterns these numbers seem to create. That's the stage where we are right now. That's still very much macro level, very much aggregate level, but in the follow-up study, which we will continue here, this year, we will delve deeper into the data at the micro level of individual researchers, individual projects perhaps even, to try to make some sense of the general patterns we see and the differences between UK universities in terms of how they interact, collaborate, engage with industry, either here in the UK itself or elsewhere, for example, in continental Europe. So our source actually is, our focus is on collaboration, research collaboration, and as the slide shows, this is actually goes straight to the heart of one of the key missions nowadays of UK universities, particularly the research intensive ones. How do they interact with society, but more specifically with the business sector, with the economy? And we have interesting data on that because we have access to a huge data source of research publications, and this source allows us to draw out some general patterns on how research universities interact, collaborate with industry. The other source is individuals, because like I said, we have an ultimate interest in the micro level. We're interested in people, the movement of people, the collaboration of people. And that also, the publications also allow us to draw that out, that kind of information. And again, during this presentation, we will show you some examples of the kind of patterns we are seeing at the level of mobility of academic research staff. So this talks to this slightly more. Having the data on which university researchers publish, with what industry, and how they publishing university researchers move through from one affiliation to the other, from within the university to industry, or back and forth, we decided to sort of develop this idea of what we call a crossover researcher. So these are people heavily engaged with both the academic world and the business world, and they seem to shift their attention. They seem to have these mobility patterns between both sectors. And we found that this is a particularly interesting viewpoint, because these people are probably sort of linking pins or gatekeepers between academia and the world of industrial R&D. So those are basically our two information sources: research collaboration and the mobility of individual researchers. And at this point, I should tell you that this presentation is a joint presentation with my colleague Alfredo, and Alfredo will talk us through part 2 of the presentation by explaining you more about the analytical model and the empirical data.
Thank you. So, yeah, I will continue with the presentation, going in more detail into the analytical model and some of the preliminary results we have so far in the project. So indeed, we are looking at the interactions between university and industry from two different perspectives. So we look at the university-industry co-publications, and we also look at researcher mobility between academia and industry. And this analysis is based on scientific publications. So we acknowledge that this analysis is not going to provide a complete picture of university-industry interactions, simply because there are many ways in which universities and industry may interact, and many of these interactions are not reflected in scientific publications. So if the company is located in the same region as the university, we classify them as local university-industry co-publications. If the business partner is located not in the same region but somewhere else in the UK, we classify them as a domestic university-industry co-publication. And if the industry is a foreign industry, is located abroad, is classified as foreign university-industry co-publication. Something else we did with this last group is to create two additional sets. So we look if the company is located in one of the European Union member states, or if it is located elsewhere in the world. We think this allows us to bring to the table additional information that perhaps could inform debates around the Brexit and possible implications, etc. So we will hear a bit more about this later on. Robert will tell us something else about this. So we'll present some first results we have in our project. So for instance, here we have in the x-axis, we have the total amount of publications that the university have produced. So each of these dots here represent one of the 47 universities. In the y-axis, we have the percentage of co-publications with industry. So what we see here is that, well, in general, it's more or less like 5% of the university publications are produced in collaboration with industry. And we see that it seems that just the size of the university, just the total amount of publications is not directly related to the intensity to which they collaborate with industry. Perhaps there are other elements that play a role here. Perhaps the disciplinary orientation of the university, or perhaps the proximity to the industrial partners are other elements that determine the intensity to which universities co-publish, in this case, with industry. In this case, we are looking at the percentage of co-publications with industry that are produced with the local industry or with domestic industry. What we see here is that there is a kind of negative relationship, and we see that some universities tend to collaborate much more with local industry than others that prefer to collaborate with industry in the UK, but outside the own region. And these are two extreme cases: London School of Economics and the University of Cranfield. Then when we look at the foreign industry, we are able to identify the universities that have a higher percentage of co-publications with foreign industry. In this table, we have the top 10 universities that co-publish more with foreign industry. All of them have co-published more than 70% of the co-publications with industry with a foreign company. And we see here that 7 out of the, I think there are 6 or 7 out of the 10, they are located in London, the region of Greater London. There are also 3 universities, 3 Scottish universities, and well, perhaps on the top we see the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, that perhaps is not very surprising to see that is on the top of the list collaborating with foreign industry. Perhaps because of the scope of the research they do, the disciplinary orientation. And here in this column we can see more or less the range of the amount of co-publications. So indeed, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, they have a very high percentage of co-publications with foreign industry, but in absolute terms, it's not that high, this amount, compared to other universities. And here is when we move. We are not looking now at the co-publications. We are looking at academics moving from universities to industry. But in a way, the picture we have here is similar to the co-publications with industry, in the sense that not always the amount of academics, of the staff in universities, determines the intensity of mobility of these academics. So here in the x-axis, we have the total amount of staff. It's of course an estimate based on scientific publications, so it's not the actual staff working at universities. In the y-axis, we have the percentage of academics we were able to identify as mobile universities moving between universities and companies. And to close my part of the presentation, something else we are planning to do. So we are planning to, of course, finish these results I just presented, but we are planning to complement, to gather more information through a survey, so that we can gather more information and complement what we see in the bibliometric analysis with additional data sources, additional information. And now I would like to ask Robert to come again to speak a bit more about the Brexit.
Okay, so what about Brexit then? Because as Alfredo already explained, we do have information on where the companies are based, and particularly whether or not they're based in continental Europe. So we now have the opportunity to identify which universities seem to have quite a lot of collaboration with continental European companies, and then therefore, in a sense, probably might be more vulnerable for the negative impacts of Brexit than others who have less higher levels of commitment, you might even say, or engagement in these European projects with European industry. So basically what we did, we used the data on this geographical distribution Alfredo was explaining, and we simply tried to find out the share of these European countries in this total pie. So this tells you that if we look at these 47 UK research-intensive universities and we look at the companies with which they co-publish, with which they collaborate, 24% of those collaborative links are with continental industry. So that's quite a substantial share, what I would say, and that already, in a sense, gives you an idea of the magnitude here. We're looking at if you start to tinker with these particular kind of relationships, if you need to renegotiate these arrangements with industry based in continental Europe, it really affects quite a large share of the current or the research relationships, the research collaborations UK universities had in the recent past. So we're looking at a really substantial part of UK industry collaboration. And again, we could take a closer look at individual universities who could be more affected than others, and this again is this top 10 list Alfredo already showed you, with London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine on top, very internationally oriented, partly because of their links with the pharmaceutical industry worldwide or with medical diagnostic firms all over the place. But if you then add the information on where is this industry actually based, is it in the EU or not, then actually you see that the London School of Economics and Political Sciences actually has quite a large percentage. More than half of the co-publications with industry are actually with industries or companies in EU member states. So if you start adding this European, this EU dimension, all of a sudden things start to shift, and some universities seem to be more vulnerable than others. Moving on, looking now at these mobile researchers, these crossover researchers I mentioned, and again, we see shifts in patterns. Again, it's the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine who has most of these crossover researchers, being affiliated with industry, being affiliated with the university, and moving between both domains. But if we take a closer look at European links with European industry, then it becomes apparent that the University of Glasgow actually has quite a lot of these people in their staff who were affiliated with industry or still are, because many of these people could have dual affiliations. So again, if you shift the perspective, if you try to focus more on European industry, you see that some universities seem to be much more engaged with European firms than others, and up to quite substantial levels actually of engagement. So what we did actually, we tried to combine both views, international mobility or cross-sectoral mobility and collaboration, and we tried to find out if we just look at the sheer numbers, just the numbers of these co-publications, of these crossover researchers, which universities would be probably most vulnerable or most affected by Brexit. It turns out that there are 8 large research-intensive universities in the UK who seem to be really at risk because they have huge numbers of these collaborative arrangements with industry in Europe, and they have quite substantial numbers of staff that have linkages or had linkages with industry on continental Europe. And the numbers actually are the following. These 8 universities had at least 400 of these joint research papers, these collaborative projects with EU industry. And actually, this is a lower threshold, because if you look at the averages is actually 700. And if we're looking at a 6-7 year time space, that means that these universities have at least 100, and this is a conservative estimate, of research projects or research programs that to some degree involve continental Europe industry. And in terms of these crossover researchers, the numbers are obviously much smaller, but still we see the same 8 universities with substantial numbers of these staff, current staff, that seem to be linked to European industry in one way or another. So in terms of risk, I would say it's the large UK universities, and some of them are of course here in the Greater London area, that seem to be most at risk if these ties are jeopardized or are severed because of Brexit. More information, like I said, we only have 20 minutes. We gave you some highlights of all the research we've done, of all the data we have. I would like to refer to our working paper, which is distributed here, or you can still get some copies at the desk, which gives you a much broader and richer overview of the data we've collected and the kind of analysis we've done so far on that data. And that's the end of this presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
So, just got about 5 minutes for questions. If you have a question, perhaps say who you are and where you're from. Anybody want to ask about the research? Simon, yeah?
What's the next step in your inquiry, Robert and Alfredo? Where does the research go from here?
Well, as Alfredo already indicated on the slide, the next stage will be moving towards the micro level, like I said, moving towards survey-based data, and also unfolding the data we now have for individual universities at the level of individual researchers. So we try to follow up on this idea of these crossover researchers, and we're trying to combine it at the individual level with the collaborative patterns. And one thing we're particularly interested in is to what degree do these crossover researchers, or any researchers who collaborate with industry, to what degree are they engaged in large consolidated R&D consortia, the kind of consortia you would expect to be funded by the European Commission, by Horizon 2020, and to what degree are these links with industry sort of one-off occasions with a firm in the US or in Canada. So we're trying to get a much richer, more diversified picture at the micro level, and that will hopefully allow us to interpret our data much better, but also again in terms of Brexit, to assess to a much finer level of detail which universities, which fields in universities, which disciplines seem to be most affected once we take a closer look at European industry and the kind of links they have with European industry.
Yeah.
Just a quick question on, going forward, is there any intention that you do a parallel kind of exercise looking at the picture from the European universities' perspective and the impact of Brexit on the European universities, rather than just focusing on the UK universities, for example?
Well, that's a good suggestion. Actually, we haven't actually thought about that, but within our database, within our analytical approach, that's certainly a possibility. Yeah. The other thing that's probably interesting also, and perhaps I should add a few words on that, is that having this database, we intend to track these developments over time. So one of my plans actually is to have a next measurement in a year's time or in 2 years' time. So that will allow us, if and how Brexit occurs is not clear, but we could actually see it as an intervention and try to find out what the effects are of Brexit on these particular kind of links with industry. Within the UK itself, of course, because those data are also available, but more so with industry in Europe or globally, actually.
Yeah, I'm also wondering if these are bilateral corporations that you were looking at, or whether this is also parts of larger networks, possibly, so several universities, maybe also European, that would be working in the same partnership with these publications. And I think that would matter in a way also to investigate larger, let's say, networks of cooperation between universities and industry more internationally.
Yeah, well, like I said, I think that is one of the key reasons why we want to delve deeper and look at it at the individual level or the level of individual publications, because that's the kind of information we're looking for and we hope to find.
Sorry, was there another question on the front row? That's fine, yeah.
So you are looking at the people who interact.
Excuse me?
You are looking at the people
Yeah.
who interact. Will you be able to get anything about the capital scale of equipment involved on both sides?
No, well, in some cases the publications are quite explicit on whether or not they are equipment intensive or not, because that would be visible in terms of keywords, for example. But the other thing we could do actually, having the data available, is to look at the funding grant acknowledgements. And there we could actually get more information on which companies, they're not necessarily co-authoring these publications, but they are definitely funding the research. So that would add an additional dimension to our information source.
And I think also to have the survey, this will allow us to collect much more information than only just the information we can see in the publications. So we can collect much more information.
Will you be then able, by doing research, to say, well, what's the project objectives, what end users, whether it's of the solve an industrial problem type, or do something, if it's cancer, for instance, whether it's about prevent, cure.
Well, one of the questions we have planned for the survey is to ask people to what degree they see their research as, let's say, use-inspired or basic. So we're trying to classify people according to the Pasteur quadrant. I'm not sure if you heard of that. Try to sort of classify them according to the type of research or the type of research orientation they are engaged in. Yeah.
Yes, one last question, yeah.
Thank you. It strikes me there's another whole sort of hinterland of really important collaboration, which may be possible to measure. I'm thinking of the extensive work that some industrial bodies and companies do on advisory boards behind research projects. The extensive, now in some areas, projects that are co-designed doctoral students with non-academic bodies. And these are quite important because some of them are attempts to change the landscape, and they're happening more in some places than others. But I hope somehow you can pay attention to those in your research going forward.
Well, actually, thank you very much. That's a very interesting suggestion, and perhaps that would be a sort of a final question to pose to the people we're about to survey. To what degree is their research, the research we are seeing, part of a larger portfolio of activities with other companies? It's a good idea.
I mean, a last note from me, particularly given the kind of wider policy climate here, is that all of those 47 universities are also undertaking teaching and have students. So the interesting question there is, are those with lots of crossover researchers, what effect is that having on the teaching and the outcomes for the students? And I can imagine there'd be quite a lot of interest in that in this country as well.
Well, one of our working hypotheses is that these crossover researchers are particularly interesting in terms of how they might affect or drive the teaching curricula in those fields with obvious industrial relevance.
Okay, that's great. I think that's the end of this.